owns the stuff that generative AI models create? Who owns the data that went into it? And what are the rights associated with those inputs and outputs?
Whether you're building something out of these community building blocks yourself, if you have a locally hosted model, or you're using one of these third-party services, you have to think about, if it's generative AI, which is where much of the interest is, you have to think about the issue of ownership of the output that is generated by this technology. And that is one way it is different from traditional software technology.
If you've been using AI and haven't considered these questions of ownership and rights, it might be a good idea to pay attention. Because even though AI might seem like the Wild West, copyright laws are pretty well established. This episode's all about understanding when copyright could be an issue when working with AI, and why. This is Compiler, an original podcast from Red Hat. I'm Johan Philippine.
I'm Kim Wong.
And I'm Angela Andrews.
On this show, we go beyond the buzzwords and jargon and simplify tech topics.
We're figuring out how people are working artificial intelligence into their lives.
This episode scratches the surface of copyright in the world of AI.
All right, let's preface this by clearly stating that even though our guest for this episode is a lawyer, we are not.
Nope.
Please do not take what we say as legal advice. All right, that's out of the way. Let's dig in here. There's been a lot of talk about copyright issues with AI models. Companies are getting sued left and right over alleged infringements. Angela, Kim, is this anything that either of you have been keeping track of or at least seeing in the news?
I'll let Angela go first, because I'm thinking about it.
Yes, I've been hearing about it, and it has been all the rage at this point. People are filing lawsuits about finding their copyrighted information, their IP, inside of these models. And it is basically the wild, wild west right now. How are we going to build the precedents? I don't know if there have been any court cases that have gone through trial and have had developments, and now we have precedents, but it just feels like this is all so new right now, and this is only the beginning.
Yeah,
I wanna get some clarity on this, Johan, because for this episode, we're talking about copyright materials being used to train AI models, right? LLMs.
That's right.
So there's a distinction between a model, a generative AI tool, for example, generating something that is copyrighted, or it having in some data set that it's pulling from copyrighted material that it's like then essentially just copying, pasting, and representing it as an original creation of that model, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah, there is a big difference in that, and we're going to get into that very specific issue. But because I'm not an expert and I also wanted a lot of clarity on this, I spoke to a lawyer.
The right person to speak to.
Right.
That's right. I spoke to Richard Fontana, who we heard from in the intro. He is a principal commercial counsel on the product privacy innovation team here at Red Hat. And he loves to talk about copyright issues. We spoke to him in the past for another episode. He wasn't on the episode, but he helped kind of give us a little bit of background on it.
Right.
And he really wanted to start us out on this topic by explaining the first instance in which copyright law can come into play with AI models.
This is technology that solves problems through a process of what's called training. So you have these things called neural networks that are trained on what is typically a vast amount of data, training data. And for large language models, which is one of the types of AI models that has attracted the most attention in the past few years, that is a huge amount of data, collected from all over the internet. So these neural networks are designed to learn from this data, to sort of extract features in a sense, and detect patterns in this data, and in the process, a kind of laborious process of engineering process of training a model, you end up with a model that is sort of tuned to solving a particular type of problem.
Right. So
Yep.
data goes in and the AI learns from all of it. And once the AI is trained on that data, you ask a question or pose a problem, and the AI will provide a solution based on the data it's trained on, right? We kind of went over this a little bit in the past couple episodes. Some of these models are trained on texts and they provide written answers. Others are trained on images and they generate pictures, right? You get the idea.
Exactly.
Now, the first thorny question is, did the model builder have the appropriate rights over the potentially copyrighted material used in the training? Are they allowed to use whatever they can find on the internet to train their model?
This seems really gargantuan. How do you know what information out on the internet is available for fair use? If you're using the internet as your to train your models, it's vast. It's copyrighted, uncopyrighted, free use, open. It's everything. But how do we navigate to find only the stuff that we are actually legally entitled to use?
And if we're not going to do it as humans, can the AI do it? And the answer right now, I'm willing to bet, is a no.
Yeah. So we've been talking about how AI is it's kind of a Wild West right now, but copyright law itself, very, very well established.
Set.
Right?
Yeah.
So you're not allowed to just take whatever you want without checking to see if it's copyrighted, even if it's just for training your model, because even the act of training your model, you're exercising that copyright. Richard explained it a little bit.
When you train a model, you are exercising the rights that are exclusive to the copyright owner necessarily, because you have to make copies. When you're training a model, you have to make copies of stuff. And so that's why there is possibly copyright infringement at all.
It's in the word.
Yeah, it's right there.
Yeah. Now, there's a saying that, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than for permission, but that doesn't make it right. Right. We have a copyright system for a reason, and even open source, which is all about providing free information and free use of software, that works within that system to facilitate that free sharing of intellectual property. In order to train a model on those unfathomable amounts of data, you need to have the right to use the data in the first place. That means getting permission from the copyright holder, if there is one.
In some cases, maybe no one owns it. In some cases, maybe someone has some sort of property claim of, intellectual property claim of some sort on it. Let's just limit it to copyright. So someone might have copyright on an item of training data. And so if you have a huge amount of training data, much of it copyrighted, that is used to create this thing. So
at the start of this series, we heard about the debate about whether quality of data or quantity of data is more important when training an AI model. Right, Christopher Newland told us about that paper that came out in 2017 from the University of Toronto and Google working together. And they kind of definitively showed that quantity is absolutely necessary for large language models. And that quantity means a lot of data. Right, now hopefully these models can show what data they used and prove that they have the right to use it in their models. But given the number of lawsuits out there that have made the news, it could be that some of these models were trained on copyrighted information that they didn't have the right to use. So, if you're going to train a model, no matter how big, you've got to make sure that you have the right to use the data that you want to use.
So this is probably an easier issue when we're talking about building models from your own data. If I am insurance company A and I have all of this customer data, PII, I have all of these tests, I have all of this data in my insurance fiefdom. That is my data.
Yeah.
But is it? But you know, like these are human beings. But we always sign away. You know, they redact and make sure that PII and PHI isn't accessible. But again, maybe another company example would be better, where you're saying, oh, I have all this data. I can use all of my data, customers, whatever. These are the easy cases. It's for maybe the layperson or this new application or this new startup that wants to do something amazing with AI, but they just don't have the access. So it's you said it, copy is in the word. I'm curious to find out how we find out if the data we're using has a copyright on it or not. And if not, will that become more prevalent as AI becomes more of this everyday word and you hear about every new model that's dropping every week? How do we decide?
I don't know, Angela. I don't know if I agree with that, because even with PII, even with kind of a set, a domain kind of specific set of data, the people that are providing that data still have to kind of opt in. They have to kind of give their permission to share, even if it's personal data like their name or their address. They still have to kind of give the consent to share that data with the company. So if that, I feel like that agreement, and it's kind of up in the air. Again, we're still in that wild west territory with AI. Does that extend then to use in an AI tool? Does that extend into an LLM? Right now, I'm thinking it might, but maybe not in some cases. We might be at a stage now where we might have to start putting in consent forms and permission forms to share for the explicit use in AI or explicit use in LLMs beyond what we've already kind of gotten into our culture, where it's like you give us your name, you give us your blood type, you give us your address so we can serve you as a customer, say for a healthcare company. So I don't know. I think it's all about consent. It's all about opting in. I think it's the same kind of concepts here. Not 100% parity, but very similar, where the person has to kind of opt in.
Well, there's a couple things there. The first one, which we are going to get into in a couple minutes, is that there are limits on copyright. There are limits as to you can use the data to train your AI, but that doesn't also mean that you can share it with other people or things like that. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that opt-in, a lot of companies are starting to do that already, where they're saying in their end user license agreements, right? The EULAs that a lot of people don't read, or they'll be updated and they'll say, we will use this data to train our AI. Or some of them are being a little bit more upfront about it and making it opt-in service, saying like, hey, if it's okay with you, you can opt in, you can check a little box, and we'll use this to make our own AI models better. And there's some other companies who are just kind of trying to sneak it in, and they're saying, doing it. Yeah, exactly. They'll update the end user license agreement, and they'll sneak it in, and then even though you've agreed to it, quote unquote, I'm making air quotes here, you're not necessarily aware of having given that consent. So there's a little bit of that back and forth that's going between some companies doing it a certain way and other companies kind of just sliding it under the radar.
Right. You know how you get those emails saying, we've changed our terms and conditions.
I want everyone to check their email and search for that. We've updated our privacy policy.
Exactly.
Go back and read it and see.
Those are the ones you got to watch out for.
Yeah, that's your homework. You'll be surprised.
You gotta look at.
You'll be surprised at how many you've already agreed to.
Yes.
All right, that brings me to thorny question number 2. When an AI model produces an output, who owns that output? Or more simply, who owns what comes out of an AI model?
Yikes.
For this part of the discussion, we focused on an example model for writing code.
And so what's unique about that, I would say, is that you have this artifact, this technical artifact, we can call it software. So this piece of software that is produced in large part, through a process that involves using data that is not owned by the person creating the model. That is different from, in a certain sense, that is different from the way that a kind of typical software application is created.
All right, let's dissect that a little bit, because it was kind of dense, but there's a lot of really useful information in there. If you're using a large language model to write code, it is very likely that the person who created the model trained that model on large amounts of data and large amounts of code that they do not own. They might have the right to use it in a model for training purposes, but that might not extend to actually sharing the code or granting the model's users access to that code.
Oh boy.
Let alone using that code itself. Right?
Wow.
So I'll give you a little example.
Yeah.
Let's say someone's building a large language model to write novels. Let's imagine this person, in order to train their model, got the rights to use all the books ever written. The extent of what they can do is often limited to training the model. This person doesn't now own these books or have absolute rights over their use and their distribution. Right? This is what I mentioned just a minute ago, where copyright rights have limitations on how you can use them. Right? Even
Yes,
if you have
licenses.
access to, exactly. Even though you can use it to train, you don't necessarily own that data, and you don't have the right to then publish that information on the internet.
Yeah, there's so many different variations of use that it's like you can use it, but you can't alter it, or you can use it, you can alter it, but you can't share it, or you can use it and alter it and share it, or sometimes you can just share, but only with attribution. It's so many different levels of it.
And so that's different from how most software is made these days, where a coder either writes it from scratch, which is becoming more and more rare, or borrows it from open source software, which is usually acquired directly from the rights holder on, say, GitHub or another repository where the person who put that code up or the group that put the code up owns the code and has applied an open source license so that other people can use it within certain restrictions.
Right. So what are we saying here?
Well, I'm sure there are a lot of our listeners out there right now who are writing software, and instead of banging their heads up against something that is not working, they're going to use some generative AI to get some code. They're going to copy and paste it, see if it works, if it does what they need to do, and ship it. Fixed a problem. I just found an answer to a problem. And is that what we're talking about here? Because if so, there are a lot of us that are very, very guilty at this point. We are so guilty. We're just gonna.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I guess the difference here is that before the proliferation of generative AI tools, specifically for people who code, people were encouraged, and to your point, Angela, to go out on the internet and find, code that they could use, code snippets they could use. But typically where those code snippets are housed and where that code is housed, they have some kind of user agreement or some kind of license, derivatives, or, I always think of Creative Commons licenses because that's what I know because I'm a creative person. But they have something there that's on a web page or on a repository that says, here is how you use this thing. What this is doing is removing that part, right? So if you're putting in a prompt into a generative AI tool to get a certain type of code, and that code has a license that is associated with it, that tool may or may not provide that license agreement for you to be able to understand how you can use it. It's just giving it to you without the context. And I think that's the problem that Rich is talking about.
It's slightly different from this, but let's listen to it real quick, and then we'll elaborate and go into it.
Now, it is true that a typical software application nowadays, most of it is going to be reusing building blocks. These days, mostly open source, building blocks that do useful things that you can just kind of plug into your whatever you're developing. But this is a little bit different. This is the sort of the fundamental behavior of the AI model is sort of shaped and determined by this training process that involves vast quantities of data that is not owned by the person creating the model. And so who does own it? That is the question.
I think he's saying the same thing that I was saying. It's just it's removing that extra kind of context of this is who owns the thing and this is how you can use it. It's removing that. It's taking that out of the context.
Well, here's the thing.
Yeah.
Some of these models and some of these very large models, they will explicitly have that at the bottom or in the license agreement. They will say, any output generated by this model is owned by the person who asked the question, right?
Ooh.
Right. So if you're putting in prompts in an AI model, anything that the model produces, they're allowing you to use, and they're saying we don't have any ownership rights over that.
Phew.
Right. So it can get pretty messy with all these layers of ownership, but in terms of who owns what data or what output is coming out from that model, some of these models very clearly state that the outputs that are created are owned by the person who asked the question, and not the company that trained the model.
Okay.
Right? So they're saying, if you use our model to write code, we do not have any copyright claim over that code.
We have absolved ourselves.
Exactly.
Ooh.
Now, whether or not that code looks like some of the code that was in the training data to begin with, that's a whole different story that we're about to get into. But before we get to that, I just want to reiterate that if you are using these models to generate code, generate text, whatever it is, and if you want to use it for yourself or for your business, make sure that you check that specific model's license agreement and see if they retain the rights over the outputs or if they give those away. It should be clearly stated, and if it is not, then I would err on the side of not using it.
Not use it, exactly.
Yeah, because typically with copyright law, it'll revert to the originator of that content, not to the whatever else you might assume.
The middle person.
Exactly.
Yes.
They just provided it. You decided to use it and didn't do your due diligence, and here comes the copyright lawyers knocking at your door.
Exactly.
Right. And I'm going to add another wrinkle to this little asterisk because Rich says mostly open source, and I'm going to put a little asterisk. Mostly is very important because some of that code, it might be proprietary, it might be copyrighted. So it's like mostly it might be proprietary code that's in there. Now, that's a whole other kind of hot button issue, right? But again, AI models remove the context.
Yeah.
What we're talking about here with copyright and ownership is context that we have as humans. Machines don't understand the context, and we have a machine that's essentially removing that context from the conversation. So that's what's really important here to understand.
Yeah, it gets very messy with the different layers of copyright ownership and permissions and right holding. We can't know. For a lot of these models who have just so much data that it would just be impossible to go through all of it, we can't know if they have all the rights to use the data or the code that they use to train their model. Hopefully, if you're using a model to do that, they can kind of clearly document, even if they're not necessarily able to show the code, they can clearly document that they have the copyright to use the data that they use to train the model. But that's not going to be the case for a lot of these large language models. Now, after the break, we're going to get into that thorny thing about what happens when the output of a model looks too much like the input, right? If it starts spitting out what it's been fed, not good.
Not boy.
Good. But we're going to take a quick break first.
Another aspect of this is that it is a feature of this technology that in some circumstances, the output may resemble some of the training data that was the input during the training process. That is not how these models are designed. They're not designed deliberately to have that behavior.
We've been talking about this a little bit, right? We don't want the models to be just spitting out the same thing that's put into them, because that's just going to go into a whole host of copyright infringement issues, and so they're designed to avoid doing that.
But are they perfect at that behavior?
They are not.
Okay.
Yep.
Despite the precautions, there's still so much we don't understand about how these AI models actually work, and sometimes that black box does the thing it's not supposed to.
That's an unintended consequence.
Yes, absolutely.
I think an unavoidable technical feature of this technology that under some circumstances you are going to see some similarities between the output. It may be rare. It does seem to be rare for the commonly used models that I'm familiar with, but it does, there are examples where it does seem to happen. And so that tendency creates another issue, because even if you have the right to use third-party copyrighted material to train a model, and that itself is a question, but you may have that right. That doesn't mean you have the right to have a model that emits that training data under some circumstances.
Right. We've been talking about this point several times now, where you have limited rights over what you can use the data and how you can use it to train your models. You can have permission to use copyrighted material to train, but that doesn't give you the right to redistribute that material, right? So someone asks, say, for a recipe, chocolate chip cookies, it's not supposed to give you a word-for-word reproduction of one of the recipes that was used to train the model.
Do not trust the recipe.
Don't trust it. Uh-oh.
Wait, what? Oh.
I kid. I mean,
Oh, okay.
What if it's like the perfect recipe that was used to train the model, and the model's like, I'm just gonna take a little license here on this yummy chocolate chip recipe, and then you go and make it, and you're like, what in the world?
I'm gonna add anchovies.
Exactly, but yeah. Prompter beware. That's all we can say.
Yeah, for recipes, I would be a
lot skeptical.
Because if you're combining different recipes, how do you know that the amounts are going to be correct? You just have to do trial and error on that one. Might as well go straight to the source. I don't know if Gen AI is going to be the best for recipes at this point. Maybe it will be in the future. Who knows? But for now, just find something on the internet rather than asking a large language model.
Right.
But that's the idea, right? That on the one hand, you don't want it to spit out someone else's recipe word for word, because that's not okay. But on the other hand, you don't know if it's going to be the right thing. So my next question for Richard was, how does all of this discussion affect me as a user, right? I don't necessarily know if the code or the recipe I'm getting from an AI model is the original or if it's a copy. And if I'm trying to use it for something other than personal reasons, is there a surefire way to know if it's okay or not, if it's a copy or if it's all right for me to use?
How do you know? You don't know for sure. Now one, because there's awareness of this problem, at least in the code generating tool area, some providers of services have provided tools that are designed to help you figure this out. So that might be, I'm not sure if that's the same as the corpus of training data or if it's something else, but it tries to identify certain matches to existing code, third-party code in public repositories, basically like code that might be public on GitHub.
So you can't know for sure, right? Unless you do a little bit of research by yourself. If you're given some pieces of code, you can kind of do a search, see if it can be found somewhere else. But you need to at least do a little bit of due diligence yourself to find out if the AI tools that you're using are producing code that is copyrighted or not.
There's sleuthing to be done, and not just changing variables and removing comments and changing function names.
Yeah.
There's going to be more to it than that.
Yep. Yeah. There's a certain degree of intuition a coder should have when it comes to using code from the internet, and that's especially true now. Richard had a really great example to share.
It's sort of like someone just walked over to your workstation and dropped some code into your editor, and you don't know where they got it from. And so you have to think about, is this like a pretty trivial piece of code, or is it extensive? And if it's extensive, does it feel like something that looks like it might have been copied? There might be something in the suggestion that makes you a little bit suspicious. And you can then maybe search around.
Right. Like we were just saying, look around to see if you can find that code anywhere. It pays to be thorough, because even if you find it in another place, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what the model was trained on. They might both have been derived from another piece of code entirely. There's another fundamental aspect of copyright law that could be applied to generated code.
Copyright protects expression, but it doesn't protect ideas. and it doesn't protect mere functionality. So in software, sometimes it is hard to tell whether something is expressive or is merely functional. So that is an issue that comes up quite a bit in traditional sort of software copyright analysis, and it could come up in an AI.
So, Johan, can you tell me what that means? I don't really know what that means.
So expressive versus functional, right? Let's do a quick example. Say you want to do a hello world kind of program in a language that you're learning about. There are only so many ways in which you can write that hello world program, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So the function of that program is, hello world. You're printing out hello world to your screen, right? That's the function of it. The expression of it is exactly how you wrote that program. Okay, so the exact terms you use, you don't really use a lot of variables for hello world, but for this example, right, the exact way in which you code that program, that's the expression of it.
Okay.
So let's take another example.
Yeah, let's please do another example, because I feel like my difficulty with Python has been well documented on the show. So let's do something else that's a little bit more in my wheelhouse.
Little higher level. Let's say you want to write a camera application for a phone. Right, you write a program that implements a camera feature, like taking a picture, zooming in and out, applying filters, all those things. The code you use to write the application is copyrightable. That's your expression, that actual code. But the idea of a camera application is not. That's the functional side of things, right? So someone else could write their own camera application and not infringe on your copyright if they don't use your code.
Okay, much better.
So that's the difference between expressive and functional, right? So
Great examples.
Thank you. So copyright covers the expressive part, not the functional part.
I got it now.
All right, we've covered a lot today. We haven't covered everything, let alone the consequences of copyright infringement. And I asked Richard what to do if you're planning to use AI-generated outputs for something other than personal use.
First of all, if you have a lawyer, you can talk to your lawyer. But if you don't have a lawyer to talk to, so you have to kind of try to figure this out on your own. So think about how extensive is the thing that you want to use. So maybe that's piece of code that a generative AI tool has produced in response to a prompt, or maybe it's I keep using the example of code because I think it's so interesting, but it could be ordinary natural language response to a prompt. The more extensive that output is, the more on your guard you should be. I think I would not exaggerate or overemphasize this type of risk. It is a real risk.
If you have a lawyer to talk to your lawyer. They'll be much better at kind of parsing the situation and figuring out, hey, can I use this? Is it okay? Is it not okay? Right?
Sound advice.
Yeah, exactly. Don't take our advice, right? Just
don't do that. And don't use generative AI as your de facto lawyer either.
Don't
ask them those questions. Don't do it.
Yeah. In the absence of those two options, if you are using generative AI and you don't have a lawyer to talk to, you got to really be careful about how you're using it. You have to judge as if it's a rather large piece of code that the generative model has produced, or if it's a smaller one, right? You have to consider whether the model is doing something that there are a few ways of doing it or not. Again, this is the expressive versus functional. There are a lot of things that you have to go through and really kind of dot your I's and cross your T's, right? However, as much as we've been talking about copyright issues today, the intention is not to send everyone into a panic.
Was it, though?
But everything we've seen so far suggests that this is rare, and I think maybe it's rare in part because of the fact that what makes these models powerful is that they're trained on such large quantities of data that you're not going to. It's unlikely that any particular output of a generative model is going to actually resemble any particular input in a non-trivial sense that would arise to the level of copyright infringement.
It's a numbers game.
That's right.
It's so much data that it would be hard to extrapolate from all this data a carbon copy of something that was used to train.
Exactly.
Because of the size of the data set.
Hard, but not impossible.
Yeah.
Yeah. The bigger the model, the less likely you are going to be to run into copyright infringement issues or getting an output from the model that really closely resembles an input.
Okay.
Right. I mean, this is something that we've been talking about. It goes back to that paper we keep going back to, right? The quantity versus the quality of the data. The larger the quantity of data, the more things get kind of mixed up and reshuffled and used in ways that are somewhat new, right? Derivative, but not carbon copies of what's gone in there. But it is a real risk, right? I mean, these things do happen. You know, again, the larger the model, the less it's going to happen. But the corollary here is that the smaller models might be more likely to run afoul of copyright protection infringements, right? And with what we've been talking about in our previous episodes, smaller models look like they're getting more and more popular, right? They're cheaper to run, they're more specialized, they're more domain specific, right? So if you are building a smaller model and you are using material that might be copyrighted
for training,
you're going to want to be extra careful of any potential outputs looking like the inputs, right?
Right. At the very least, get legal representation and make sure that you're covered.
100%. Yep.
Sounds like sound advice.
All right. So that does it for today. Yeah. If you're going to use AI for more than personal use, be aware of the copyright issues we've been talking about. Do even more research, because this is just scratching the surface. And make sure you've got all your legal ducks lined up in a row.
Research.
Don't just take things at face value. Definitely do your due diligence, as you would with everything else.
Exactly. And to all of our listeners, we know this topic is hot on your minds. We want to hear about it. How are you using it? Are you bumping up against these type of issues in your work? And how have you remedied them? Or if not, are you curious about, well, what does this look like? Where are the lawsuits? Like, where do I go to find out more? You have to share this all with us. So hit us up on our socials at Red Hat. Always use the hashtag Compiler Podcast, and we would love to hear what you have to say about this. And that does it for this episode of Compiler.
This episode was written by Johan Philippine.
Victoria Lawton is keenly aware of copyright law.
Thank you to our guest, Richard Fontana.
Thank you so much for listening. Compiler is produced by the team at Red Hat with technical support from Dialect.
Our theme song was composed by Marianne Chetta.
If you liked today's episode, please follow the show, rate the show, and leave a review. Share it with someone you know. It really helps us out.
Thank you so much for listening. Can't wait to hear from you again. Until next time.
See ya.